So we're going to go over how to install a hydraulic quick coupler on an 848H Lugong. So the first step in doing this would be put the coupler on. The way we do it here at Craig Manufacturing is to put the bottom pins in first and then rotate it up in and put the center link on. And of course, being careful to make sure it's shimmed nice and snug on all the gaps that remain. Make sure the grease seals are in, and that's step one. All right, the next step is to mount the valve inside the front module. But before we do that, we want to make sure that we have a brace underneath the coupler or underneath the arm for safety purposes. If for some reason some portion of the hydraulics let go, it just keeps you safe. So to give you perspective, we're going to go in underneath. All right, now that we're underneath here, as you can see, there's a gold valve up in there. That's a solenoid valve. And the way it works is it always allows pressure to the pins to keep the coupler locked. And again, we showed you in the previous segment that if your hand's on the button, then it's unlocked. If your hand's off the button, then the coupler's locked. We chose to mount it using existing bolts where you can see where our bracket is. The next step is to run the hoses from where we just were by the gold valve. Run those hoses up through the same location that the auxiliary valve on the loader comes up through. Run them up through to the cross tube and terminate them there. And then we do the jumper hoses from this point down through the loop, and we end them there. The next thing to do is to come from the pilot supply valve, and we use T's to tap into the pilot supply valve in this location and in this location. So as you can see, this is the return and this is the pressure, and you can see that it's marked on the hoses as well. So to show the distinction, now that we've come from the pilot supply valve back up to the gold valve that I've been referring to earlier, just wanted to distinguish the different hoses and where they're oriented. So as you can see, the pilot pressure is the one coming in the near side, I guess, in my orientation. The tank is coming in the bottom, and the lock and unlock are on the far side, with unlock being the top one and lock being the bottom one. The connection between the button up in the cab and the fuse panel, and this is the wire that comes down to the pilot valve to operate the solenoid. In order to come down through the floor, we're going to install this piece, but in order to get the wire through this piece, Joe's going to show you how to take that apart. And then obviously it would then fit into this component. You could just go ahead, Joe, and take that apart. And now that he's done that, he puts the other side back on, and we can put a seal through the floor up in the cab so that dust and wetness or moisture can doesn't make its way back up into the cab. So what we're demonstrating in this segment is that we add a Deutsch connector to the wire coming off the valve. That makes it so that our wiring harness works. Makes it easier that if the valve ever needs to be replaced, you've got a quick connection that you can just pull off and re-plug in. In a previous segment, we showed you the gray connector that forms the seal on the floor. That connector takes an 11/16 drilled hole. So that allows for there to be a seal on the floor, and then the wire comes up through the floor. Obviously, in this video, we've got some panels pulled off. You wouldn't see all this exposed, so that kind of keeps a nice clean installation. So that wire comes up through. You can see it coming up through there behind the panel. and then it eventually makes its way up to the button that you see there. We remove the panel behind the seat to expose the fuse box, and inside the fuse box we do a add a fuse connector that we try to make nice and neat and come down through, and we get our ground from this location. In an effort to point out some of the things that Craig Manufacturing does to be safe, again, I'm going to point out the fact that we should have your boom arms come down on a brace. Again, in case something goes wrong, there wouldn't be a crushing point. The other thing we do, just so that we don't have oil going places we don't want it, we put a Venturi valve on the tank to make sure that nothing can leave the tank. And of course, use your gloves and your eye and ear protection as always.